The Merrin house stood at the edge of town like a sentinel of old secrets, its peeling shutters and gnarled oaks casting shadows that seemed almost alive. Children whispered about it on the playground, and even the adults avoided its cracked stone path after dark. Inside, the family moved with a harmony that was almost too precise, too rehearsed, a choreography of smiles and polite nods hiding something beneath the surface. Every Merrin's son, it was said, married his twin sister, a tradition older than anyone dared to question. Visitors felt a strange pull when they entered, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, and the twins moved in perfect synchrony, their laughter echoing through halls lined with portraits that seemed to watch, silently judging. Generations of this ritual had passed, leaving a trail of whispered rumors and quiet disappearances, but no one dared speak openly. Until one night, in the flickering glow of candlelight, a Merrin's son could no longer keep the truth buried. His eyes met his twins across the dinner table, and for the first time, doubt had a voice. What began as a soft, trembling confession would unravel everything the town believed about the Merrins, exposing a darkness that had thrived in silence for decades. The Merrin family had always been the picture of perfection in their small, isolated town. From the outside, their lives seemed orderly and enviable, a model of discipline and familial devotion that inspired both admiration and quiet envy. Every holiday, every Sunday dinner, and every community gathering showcased their unity. The twins of the family moved in uncanny synchrony, their movements mirrored as if rehearsed, their laughter harmonized to a degree that made even close friends feel slightly off-kilter. Neighbors often commented on the strong bond the family shared, unaware that the warmth and charm were carefully maintained facades, hiding rituals and secrets that stretched back generations. Visitors who came to the Merrin home were struck by the meticulous cleanliness, the smell of fresh-baked bread that seemed always present, and the soft hum of conversation that never veered into discord. It was a house that radiated control, where every detail, from the positioning of chairs to the timing of meals, spoke of a family obsessed with perfection and propriety. Children in the neighborhood whispered stories about the twins, about how they always seemed to finish each other's sentences or anticipate each other's needs before they were spoken aloud. Adults dismissed these tales as harmless exaggerations, yet an uneasy tension lingered in the corners of the conversations. In school, the Merrin children were admired for their intelligence, discipline, and grace, but teachers occasionally noticed an eerie uniformity in their behavior, a rigidity that seemed unnatural for children so young. The family's reputation as kind, polite, and deeply connected masked an undercurrent of something far darker. Generations of Merrins had adhered to unspoken rules that governed their lives with a strictness that outsiders could not perceive. The very notion of deviation from these rules was inconceivable, and the twins were always central to maintaining the order, their unity a tool for controlling the household and ensuring that the family's legacy remained unbroken. There was a rhythm to their lives that outsiders mistook for harmony, but those within the walls understood it as something far more deliberate, a careful choreography designed to protect secrets too terrible to speak aloud. And while the townspeople saw only the flawless surface, the truth simmered beneath, an invisible tension that stretched across the generations. Every smile, every polite gesture, every carefully measured word was part of a pattern, a hidden mechanism that kept the family's shadowed history locked away, invisible to the world, even as it shaped every moment of their outwardly perfect lives. As the years passed, a pattern began to emerge within the Merrin family, one that outsiders could sense but never fully understand. It started subtly, with whispered observations at town gatherings, fleeting comments from distant relatives, and the quiet murmurs of neighbors who had grown up alongside the family. Every Merrin's son seemed to choose the same path, a path that led inevitably toward their twin sister. At first, the town dismissed it as coincidence or simply the result of an exceptionally close sibling bond, but the repetition across generations was impossible to ignore. The twins, always inseparable in appearance and manner, were regarded with a mix of fascination and unease. Their connection went beyond affection, it carried an intensity that felt unnatural, as if each could sense the other's thoughts and desires with perfect clarity. When a Merrin's son reached adulthood, marriage followed, and almost without exception, it was to his twin. Families who attempted to introduce outsiders into the Merrin household found doors closed, smiles polite but distant, as if the very air around the twins repelled intrusion. Rumors circulated quietly, hinting at secret ceremonies and ancient family laws, though no one dared ask directly. In town, the pattern was an unspoken truth, a shadow that hovered over the Merrins even as they maintained their flawless public image. People noticed the twins' uncanny resemblance, not just in appearance but in behavior, in voice, in the smallest gestures. Their interactions were fluid and seamless, leaving observers with the uncomfortable sense that something had been engineered over decades. Birth records, when examined, revealed a strange uniformity in timing and pairing, as though generations of family members had followed an invisible blueprint. Some historians and genealogists quietly speculated about genetic experimentation or obsessive adherence to tradition, while the townspeople preferred to avert their gaze, afraid of what acknowledgement might bring. The twins themselves carried the burden of expectation with a calm that belied the strain it imposed. From childhood, they were groomed to fulfill a role that extended beyond love or family loyalty, a role that ensured the family's lineage remained unbroken and contained. The elders spoke of duty and preservation, framing the practice as necessary and honorable, but the younger generation, especially those with glimpses of the wider world, sometimes felt the weight of confinement pressing in. The repetition of the tradition across decades, the invisibility of any deviation, and the meticulous care with which the family maintained appearances created an atmosphere of creeping inevitability. It was a legacy that shaped every decision, every conversation, and every emotion within the household, leaving the Merrins bound together in ways that outsiders could admire, fear, or fail to comprehend, while the truth beneath the polished surface remained hidden, growing heavier with each passing year. The arrival of an outsider into the Merrin household disrupted the carefully constructed rhythm of their lives in ways that had been unimaginable for generations. He or she came with fresh eyes, untainted by the subtle rules and unspoken codes that had governed the family for decades. At first, the newcomer was treated with the customary politeness reserved for guests, welcomed with warm smiles, carefully prepared meals, and a tour of the house that showcased its immaculate order. Every room was pristine, every surface polished, and every family member performed their roles with clockwork precision, their unity on full display. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions began to ripple, small cracks appearing in the facade that no Merrin had ever allowed to be visible before. The outsider noticed it almost immediately. The twins' movements mirrored one another too perfectly, their conversations flowed in uncanny synchrony, and their glances carried messages that no words could explain. While others had grown accustomed to this seamless performance, the newcomer could not ignore the oddity, sensing that something unspoken governed every interaction. They began to notice other peculiarities as well, the strict avoidance of certain topics, the careful modulation of voice and expression, and the occasional, fleeting look of discomfort that crossed a twin's face when the family elders spoke. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching and reacting to the presence of someone who did not belong, a silent observer registering every deviation from the script. The outsider's curiosity, initially tempered by polite restraint, slowly evolved into suspicion. Late at night, while the rest of the family slept or engaged in their rehearsed domestic rituals, the newcomer wandered the halls, hearing whispers and catching glimpses of conversations that hinted at long-buried secrets. Letters hidden in drawers, journals tucked behind bookshelves, and the eerie arrangement of family portraits all spoke of a lineage carefully controlled, of patterns maintained with obsessive precision, and of a history that the Merrins did not wish to reveal. Even the townspeople, who had long accepted the family's outward perfection, seemed to react differently when the outsider spoke of what they had observed. Eyebrows would lift, voices would drop, and subtle warnings would be issued. The presence of this new perspective illuminated the cracks in the Merrins' polished world, forcing questions that no one had dared ask aloud, and it became increasingly clear that the pattern of twin marriages, the hidden rituals, and the suffocating loyalty to family tradition were not merely eccentricities, but deeply rooted practices that had shaped every generation. The outsider's awareness, combined with their unwillingness to blindly accept the family's explanations, set into motion a chain of events that would challenge the very foundations of the Merrin legacy, threatening to expose secrets that had been meticulously guarded for decades and changing the household forever. Doubt began to creep into the mind of one of the Merrin's sons, a quiet seed planted by the outsider's questions and the subtle disturbances that had begun to unsettle the household. For the first time in his life, he noticed the repetition in the family's choices, the way each son had married his twin sister without exception, and how each marriage seemed less about love than about adherence to some invisible law passed down from generation to generation. What had always seemed natural and unquestionable, the twins' inseparable bond, the elders' approving smiles, the town's unspoken acceptance, suddenly appeared suffocating, a cage constructed over decades to preserve a legacy no one outside the family fully understood. He began to see the patterns in the interactions of his parents and older siblings, the carefully rehearsed gestures, the unspoken communications, and the tiny, almost imperceptible warnings delivered through a glance or a shift in posture. Each observation chipped away at the unquestioned belief that had governed his life, and a sense of unease settled over him that could not be ignored. Memories from childhood surfaced with new clarity, the whispered admonitions, the fleeting looks of disappointment when curiosity strayed too far, and the subtle lessons on the importance of maintaining the family's reputation. It became evident that the family's obsession with perfection and secrecy was not merely a quirk but a deliberate effort to maintain control, to enforce a cycle that had existed for generations without interference. He began to imagine the possibilities of a life outside the rigid structure, a life where love and choice could exist independently of duty and tradition. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It brought with it the recognition that challenging the family could provoke consequences far beyond simple disapproval. At night, he lay awake, wrestling with the knowledge that the very foundation of his existence, the family, the home, and the rituals that had defined his life, was built upon an expectation that he could no longer accept without question. The weight of generations pressed heavily upon him, yet the seed of rebellion, of curiosity, had been sown, and it could not be easily uprooted. Conversations that once seemed ordinary now carried new meaning, and he began to notice the subtle ways the elders monitored behavior, controlling not through overt force but through suggestion, expectation, and fear. As he contemplated the consequences of defiance, he also recognized the possibility of liberation, the chance to break the cycle, to see the outside world, to challenge the inevitability that had bound every Merrin's son before him. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that the family's legacy, carefully maintained and silently enforced, was neither natural nor harmless, and that the choice to confront it or to continue within it would define not only his own fate but potentially the fate of the generations to come. In the quiet hours of a restless night, the questioning Merrin's son stumbled upon evidence that had been hidden for decades, tucked away in the shadows of the house where no outsider had dared look. Behind a false panel in the library, beneath stacks of untouched ledgers and dust-covered books, he discovered a collection of journals and letters bound in cracked leather, the ink faded but still legible. The pages revealed intimate accounts from ancestors, written in a tone of secrecy and fear, chronicling lives governed by a rigid and disturbing tradition. As he read, he realized that every generation had meticulously documented the twin marriages, the ceremonies that ensured the continuation of the family line, and the unspoken rules that dictated behavior down to the smallest gesture. The journals spoke of pregnancies carefully arranged, of unions that were considered sacred within the family but grotesque in the eyes of the outside world, and of the pressures exerted on each new generation to uphold a legacy that had become a kind of prison. Some entries were desperate, almost frantic, as though the writers had understood the moral and psychological consequences of their obedience yet saw no alternative, trapped by loyalty, superstition, or fear of retribution. There were mentions of children born with illnesses, of whispered rumors in town that never reached beyond the doors of the household, and of the subtle punishments administered to those who questioned the family's practices. Each revelation deepened the son's understanding of the system that had dictated his own upbringing. The letters contained accounts of older siblings warning the younger ones about the dangers of deviation, of veiled threats disguised as guidance, and of the careful cultivation of obedience through shame and secrecy. The son began to notice patterns across decades, the meticulous way in which every detail was preserved and hidden simultaneously, as if the family were both documenting their deeds for posterity and shielding them from discovery. What had once been vague unease became a stark clarity. The Merrin legacy was a carefully maintained cycle, and each twin's existence, each marriage, was a piece of an unbroken chain stretching back generations. The weight of knowledge pressed upon him, filling him with both horror and a grim determination. He realized that the journals and letters were more than mere historical artifacts, they were a map of the family's morality, a mirror reflecting the hidden sacrifices and sins that had shaped every member of the household. With each page turned, he felt the boundaries between obedience and rebellion blur, and the inevitability of confronting the truth grew stronger, until the question of whether to remain silent or to expose the dark reality of the Merrin family became impossible to ignore, demanding a reckoning that would shake the foundations of everything he had known. As the questioning son began to piece together the hidden history of the Merrin family, whispers from the town began to reach his ears, subtle yet laden with implication. People spoke of the Merrins in hushed tones, their voices dropping when strangers were near, a mixture of fear, fascination, and judgment woven into every word. Some claimed the family was cursed, that generations of twins had been bound together by something unnatural, an invisible force that demanded loyalty and secrecy. Others hinted at madness, speaking of sudden disappearances, unexplained illnesses, and odd behaviors that could not be fully explained. These murmurs, though never confirmed, carried the weight of long-held suspicion and gave the questioning son a sense of context for the unease he had felt his entire life. Even those closest to the family seemed to tread carefully, offering polite smiles but avoiding deeper engagement, as if the Merrin house itself exuded a silent warning. Within the walls of his home, the son could feel the tension tighten like a coil, a subtle but constant pressure that demanded conformity. The elders, ever watchful, seemed to sense the intrusion of both the outsider and his own growing doubt, their eyes sharp and calculating, measuring each movement and word. Occasionally, a sibling would glance at him with a look of unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the traditions that governed them, and yet a flicker of uncertainty passed through their gaze as well. The son began to understand that these whispers of madness and curse were not merely idle gossip but reflections of the consequences faced by those who strayed from the family's invisible code. Fear had been a powerful tool in maintaining the cycle, shaping the behaviors of every Merrin child long before they could fully comprehend its meaning. The combination of these external warnings and internal pressures created an almost suffocating environment in which the son's curiosity and defiance were both dangerous and irresistible. He felt the weight of generations pressing upon him, the collective expectations of those who had followed the same patterns without question, and the knowledge that any deviation might provoke a cascade of consequences that no one could predict. The whispers from the town, once distant and easily dismissed, now seemed like echoes of truths too long ignored, reflections of the unspoken terror that had always lurked just beyond the family's polished image. With each passing day, the son became increasingly aware of the delicate balance the family maintained between outward perfection and inner darkness, and the way in which these whispers of madness and curse served both as warnings and as evidence of a hidden legacy that demanded obedience, shaping not only the lives of the Merrins themselves but the perception of the world around them, and leaving him to confront the growing realization that knowledge of the truth carried consequences as heavy and unavoidable as the traditions that had defined his family for generations. Amid the oppressive weight of family expectation and the suffocating rhythm of the Merrin household, the questioning son discovered a spark of something entirely forbidden, a connection outside the tightly controlled circle of twins and elders. It began innocuously enough, a conversation with someone who had no knowledge of the family's long-standing rituals, someone whose presence felt like sunlight in a house that had known only shadows. The bond grew gradually, a mixture of curiosity, attraction, and the intoxicating thrill of speaking freely without the ever-watchful eyes of the family monitoring every gesture. Each encounter brought with it a sense of liberation, a taste of a life where choices were made from desire rather than duty, where the rules that had governed generations could be challenged. Yet, even as he reveled in the excitement, a deep anxiety festered beneath the surface. He understood the consequences of stepping outside the bounds of the family's tradition, of forming a bond that defied centuries of expectation. The elders' vigilance had never been more apparent, their subtle interrogations and pointed questions carrying the weight of implied punishment, a reminder of the power they wielded over the household. Despite the son could not deny the pull of this forbidden connection, the way it illuminated possibilities he had never allowed himself to imagine. In its presence, the rigid patterns of the household, the mirrored movements of the twins, the strict adherence to silent rules, the invisible chains of loyalty seemed to lose some of their potency, and for the first time, the son experienced a sense of agency. The relationship, though clandestine, became a lens through which he could examine the true cost of the family tradition, the suppression of individuality, the stifling of choice, and the subtle coercion masked as love and duty. Every stolen glance, every whispered conversation, carried with it both exhilaration and dread, a reminder that the line he was crossing was more than social, it was ancestral. The outsider's influence emboldened him, forcing him to confront the morality of the twin marriages and the broader implications of maintaining such a system. The tension between loyalty and desire grew unbearable, manifesting in restless nights and moments of quiet panic as he considered the repercussions of disobedience. Still, the bond offered a clarity that the family had never provided, a mirror reflecting the life that might exist beyond the shadowed halls, beyond the suffocating expectations, and beyond the unbroken cycle of twins and secrecy. It was a revelation that came with both hope and terror, for the very act of pursuing it challenged not only his own place in the family but threatened to unravel a carefully preserved legacy, forcing him to weigh love and freedom against duty and fear in a way that no Merrin before him had ever dared. The confrontation came sooner than he had expected, a moment both terrifying and inevitable that shattered the fragile equilibrium he had clung to. The elders, long silent observers of his growing curiosity and subtle defiance, cornered him one evening in the dimly lit parlor, their presence overwhelming and commanding, each word weighted with centuries of authority. They spoke not with anger but with a calmness that made their intentions more chilling, outlining the rules that had governed the Merrin family for generations and the importance of maintaining the cycle that ensured the preservation of their bloodline. Every syllable seemed to carry the weight of ancestral expectation, the collective pressure of countless twins who had come before him, all of whom had complied without question. The son felt the full force of the family's gaze, the intensity of scrutiny that made his own thoughts feel exposed, stripped bare beneath their calculated watchfulness. They reminded him of the consequences of deviation, hinting at punishments both subtle and extreme, a mixture of social exile, emotional manipulation, and whispered threats that had always lurked beneath the surface of the household. The parlor, once familiar and safe, seemed transformed into a chamber of judgment, the shadows cast by the flickering fire stretching like fingers across the walls, as though the house itself were complicit in enforcing the family's authority. Every argument he had prepared, every rationalization or plea for freedom, faltered beneath the elders' unwavering calm, and he realized that the power of tradition was more suffocating than he had imagined. They spoke of duty, of honor, and of the sacred responsibility to preserve the family line, framing each assertion as both moral imperative and spiritual necessity. As the conversation wore on, he began to understand the depth of their commitment, the lengths to which they had controlled each generation, shaping desires, bending wills, and enforcing obedience through a mixture of love, fear, and expectation. And yet, within him, a quiet defiance had begun to take root, fueled by the knowledge of the outsider, by the glimpses of life beyond the family's carefully maintained boundaries, and by the growing awareness that choice, once glimpsed, could not easily be forgotten. The confrontation left him shaken but more resolute, a mixture of dread and determination settling over him as he realized the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. It was no longer merely a question of disobedience or rebellion, it was a reckoning with the legacy of generations, a test of courage and morality in a household where the weight of secrecy and expectation pressed upon every word, every glance, and every heartbeat, forcing him to confront the terrifying reality of what it meant to challenge a family whose control extended far beyond what most could comprehend, and whose influence reached into every corner of his mind and life. The moment of truth arrived with a sudden, almost violent clarity, a tipping point that shattered the careful silence the Merrin family had maintained for generations. The questioning son, driven by a mixture of fear, anger, and a desperate need for liberation, could no longer contain the secret that had haunted every corner of the household. One evening, in front of relatives, neighbors, and the outsider who had unwittingly set this chain of events into motion, he spoke. His voice trembled at first, uncertain and small, but grew stronger with each word as the reality of the family's ritual, the marriages between twin siblings, the cycles of secrecy and manipulation, was laid bare. Gasps filled the room, followed by stunned silence, as the magnitude of the revelation settled over the listeners. Some twins clutched each other instinctively, their hands shaking, their faces pale with disbelief and shame, while the elders' expressions darkened into a mask of anger, fear, and disbelief, as if centuries of carefully guarded authority were being stripped away in an instant. Outside the room, whispers rippled through the town like a shockwave, carrying the truth into corners that had long ignored the family's strange reputation. The son continued, recounting the patterns he had discovered, the hidden journals, the letters, and the subtle punishments, the careful grooming of generations to enforce obedience, and the quiet horrors that had been normalized over decades. Each revelation seemed to fracture the veneer of normalcy that had long concealed the family's reality, leaving both onlookers and participants reeling. Some neighbors, who had always suspected oddities, now struggled to reconcile the perfection they had admired with the darkness revealed before them, a tension that made their own perception of the town feel fragile and unreliable. Within the household, the twins were caught between instinctual loyalty and dawning awareness, unable to respond fully to a truth that contradicted everything they had been taught to accept. The elders, faced with the collapse of the cycle they had so meticulously maintained, could only react with a mixture of denial and desperate attempts to assert control, their authority suddenly fragile, human, and fallible. And the son, though terrified of the consequences, social exile, family rupture, or worse, felt a strange sense of release, as if the act of speaking aloud had lifted a weight he had carried unknowingly for his entire life. In exposing the secret, he had forced the household and the town alike to confront a reality that had been suppressed for generations, a truth so dark and pervasive that it would ripple through the family's legacy, challenging bonds, loyalties, and perceptions, and setting in motion consequences that would forever alter the lives of every Merrin, while also forcing the community to reckon with the shadows it had long refused to acknowledge. The aftermath of the revelation was immediate and suffocating, a storm that tore through the Merrin household and spilled into the town that had long lived in quiet curiosity and fear of the family. The son who had spoken the truth found himself at the center of a chaos he could never have fully anticipated, a whirlwind of emotion, accusation, and disbelief. Within the house, siblings reacted in drastically different ways, some with horror, clutching each other as if the revelation threatened their very sanity, others with denial, insisting that the story could not possibly be true, that the tradition they had always followed was natural and necessary. The elders, whose authority had been built over decades of secrecy and manipulation, struggled to regain control, their power undermined by the one they had most underestimated, and by the knowledge that the cycle they had so carefully maintained was no longer hidden. Outside the household, the town reacted with a mixture of fascination and outrage. Neighbors who had long whispered in secret now spoke openly, their curiosity mingled with fear, disbelief, and an almost voyeuristic attention to the collapse of the family's carefully maintained image. The son's act of disclosure had not only shattered the illusion of perfection within the Merrin home but also forced the town to confront its complicity in ignoring or minimizing the oddities of the family for generations. Some siblings fled the house entirely, seeking freedom from the oppressive legacy that had dictated every aspect of their lives, while others remained, paralyzed by fear, guilt, or loyalty, trapped in the ruins of a world that had once felt stable and ordered. The outsider, whose arrival had initially seemed inconsequential, now became a witness to a family unraveling, their presence a reminder that observation and curiosity could ignite consequences far beyond what anyone had imagined. The revelation left scars that went beyond individual pain, it fractured relationships, undermined trust, and exposed generational trauma that had been carefully buried. The community itself struggled to process the truth, balancing revulsion, sympathy, and an unsettling recognition that the darkness of the Merrin household had been an open secret, obscured only by politeness and fear of confrontation. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible sense of possibility, a chance for the younger generation, including the son who had spoken, to redefine their lives, to break free from a cycle that had governed so many before them. The weight of secrecy had been lifted, and though the future remained uncertain and the legacy of the family forever tainted, the exposure of the truth created space for change. The town, the family, and the individuals within it were all left to navigate a new reality in which the carefully maintained patterns of the past could no longer dictate the present, leaving a haunting mixture of liberation, fear, and unresolved tension that would linger far beyond the moment of revelation.